The world is divided into 4 spheres, each sphere divided among continents and nations. Nations are divided by borders and interests. These interests divide the news. We examine the impact of these divisions on people and power. This is Imaginary Lines. Welcome to Imaginary Lines. I'm your host, Michael Fox. Hundreds of thousands of Mexican and Central American migrants are deported from the United States each year. These deportations often break up families, destroy lives, and put the well-being of these migrants at risk as they're forced to return to dangerous countries and face oftentimes extreme violence. Even before undocumented individuals are deported, however, they're detained and held for days, weeks, months, or even years, awaiting sentencing and potential deportation. Despite lip service from the Obama administration, the number of deportations remains high, and the impact on undocumented individuals and their families is tremendous. For our last episode of the year, I speak with immigrant rights organizer Raul Al-Qaraz Ochoa for a look inside the U.S. immigration detention system at the impact on families and particularly on individuals in detention who are self-identified as LGBT and trans. We'll also take a look at how immigrants and communities are organizing in response. Raul Al-Qaraz Ochoa is an immigrant rights organizer based in Tucson, Arizona. He's been fighting detentions and deportations for years, and he's the co-founder of 2 grassroots organizations for undocumented families and individuals. Raul, thank you so much for joining me in Imaginary Lines.
Thank you for having me. A pleasure.
Raul, paint a picture for me of the reality for undocumented immigrants in the United States right now, and particularly for those in detention centers and their families.
Arizona, being a border state between the U.S. and Mexico, is probably the most militarized, or one of the most militarized places in the entire country, where there's billions of dollars invested in customs and border protection, in the Department of Homeland Security, and these law enforcement agencies that are colluding to make an environment so hostile and so oppressive for immigrant communities there. And so the situation since 2006 and up to this day has been one of continuous attacks where it's this strategy of the state of making it life so impossible to have a livelihood for immigrants in the state, whether it's work and cutting access to work, cutting access to social services, cutting access to public safety, and cutting access to the school system and public education universities, that because of those things, that logic of the right wing in Arizona has been that people will self-deport, right? And that people will leave the state or leave the country. And so you had this growing sentiment, this growing anti-immigrant policies that culminate with SB 1070, Senate Bill 1070, that basically legalizes racial profiling, and local law enforcement that have reasonable suspicion that a person is undocumented, then they would have to investigate their immigration status and call Border Patrol so that the person would be funneled into the deportation machine.
Last year, you wrote an op-ed in The Advocate about the horrendous abuse against LGBT and trans undocumented immigrants in detention centers, including solitary confinement, rape, and sexual assault by inmates and guards. Talk about the reality for these individuals in these detention centers and the organization Mariposas Sin Fronteras that you founded in response.
So we had, due to the situation of a lot of our community members being held in detention, they spread the word inside about our group, and it got to the ears of people that identify as either gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, that they reached out to us and wrote letters to us about their experiences as LGBTQ people in immigration detention. And from that, we felt the need to create an organization that would just dedicate itself to providing support for people that are LGBTQ in immigration detention, and created Mariposas Sin Fronteras. And so what we have experienced and seen is that people that identify as transgender suffer horrifying. I mean, we're talking about the detention system and how it is unfair and unjust and inhumane to everyone and anyone, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And we feel that detention and deportation should not exist for anyone, right? And so when you go within that and look at how different groups are impacted by the system, we see how LGBTQ people are particularly exposed to violence at another level, right? And we see that transgender women, we've seen situations where there have been situations where a transgender woman that is HIV positive, for example, we saw that guards would just randomly have conversations with her about her HIV status out loud in front of other people in detention. And so that caused a lot of aggression towards this person that was outed publicly in front of other guards and other other detainees about her HIV status. So we witnessed that. We saw verbal abuse from guards and them calling transgender women by their male, with male pronouns when they don't identify as such, and using their birth name, which they don't identify with anymore. We saw also situations where trans women and gay men that that identified in a feminine way were harassed in their pods, in their units, and when they would respond with, you know, like letting a guard know, they were actually the ones put in solitary confinement and segregated as the ones blamed for that situation and that happening. So we have seen a huge impact that trans women in particular are facing in detention. And we feel that there is no way that Immigration Customs Enforcement can provide a safe space for people that are LGBTQ, for anyone really, but we demand that there be no person that's LGBTQ that be in detention for the fact that they're unable and unwilling to provide a space to have a trans woman, for example, feel safe and not, because trans women are placed in male facilities, you know, so that in and of itself is something that that should not occur, because it exposes them to sexual assault in ways that we've seen that are horrifying. And there are detention centers and corporations that are profiting from detention and own these facilities, like CCA of America and Geo Group, that are the two largest for-profit prison companies that ICE contracts to run these facilities. And so there are, the CCA, for example, has been sued due to guards sexually abusing trans women in detention. So we're seeing that the system of detention and deportation disproportionately and particularly impact LGBTQ people is a huge concern of ours, and that's why we demand that no LGBTQ person be held in detention, and that no detention center exists. You know, that they be closed is actually our vision.
And Raul, what can we expect from overall organizing looking forward toward 2016?
Yeah, I think that if detention and deportation continue in the levels that we've seen, which have been unprecedented in the history of the United States, it won't matter who the next president will be. It doesn't matter if it's Donald Trump or if it's Hillary Clinton or whoever from whatever party is going to be. We see that the patterns continue, and they continue escalating. They continue funding more money to the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Protection. We see that their investment is in the militarization, is in the police state, it's in mass incarceration and detention specifically. Like all that, we see that will remain untouched largely. And so I personally believe that if those things are to continue, then that means our movement also needs to continue, needs to escalate, and needs to address the root causes of migration, and that we also adopt tactics that will lead us towards the vision of like no longer having detention and deportation period for anyone. And so addressing this as like state violence and making connections with the mass incarceration aspect and the Black Lives Matter movement, and how there's impunity whether a migrant is being murdered and shot at the border by a border patrol agent, or a young African American male or female being shot in Ferguson, right, by local police. And so I see these connections as really intertwined, and I really see a lot of hope and a lot of expectation that our movements really connect, and that we begin to be more in solidarity with one another, because I feel like there's a huge power within the migrant and Latino community, along with the Black and African American community. And so I feel like if those forces are united and we place front and center the struggles of both communities and the LGBTQ community and women, that this could potentially turn into something that is a movement that really makes changes and really begins to threaten the systems of oppression that are the root cause of a lot of our oppression. So I think heading towards movement building in solidarity with one another to address the common enemy, and doing tactics that can really impact the system and make it really visible, I feel that this is something that could continue to grow and really affect change in our communities.
Well, Raul, thank you so much for joining me in Imaginary Lines. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for watching. This was our last episode of 2015. Looking forward to next year. We've got an exciting new lineup with some excellent programming. Keep an eye out particularly for our media analysis. It's essentially Imaginary Lines 2.0. As always, thanks for watching. I'm your host, Michael Fox. We'll see you next year.